Hello, this is Simon Brew. And this is the Film Stories Podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is completely given away in its title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, of how hard it is to make films and gratitude that films are made. All that preamble done, without further ado then, I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. Going back to 2015 for this one, I'm just going to play you a little bit from the trailer and I'll come to the story of it, the other side of this.
You're not built for this. These boys coming here, they gotta fight for life. People die in the ring. Your daddy died in the ring. I don't know him. Ain't got nothing to do with me. I've been fighting my whole life. It's not a choice for me. Every punch I ever thrown's been on my own. Nobody showed me how to do this. I'm ready.
Sick eyes from the nose pressure. Release slip zip ties on the protesters. The 6 wives in the fry of a mold weather. Medic caviar bar out in Odessa. Dirty needles breaking all the old records. 100 hoes, one shovel and some old treasure. Old seat use teeth as a gold tester. Figaro's finger waves crossing from the old numbers.
This picture's from the 10th round of the first fight, right? I heard about a third fight between you and Apollo. Behind closed doors. Is that true?
How do you know all this?
That then is a clip from 2015's Creed, directed by Ryan Coogler, with a screenplay by Coogler and Aaron Covington, story by Coogler, starring Michael B. Jordan, Sylvester Stallone, Tessa Thompson, Felicia Rashad and Anthony Belleau. And the film is, well, I mean, for a while after Sylvester Stallone had successfully revived Rocky on the big screen with 2006's Rocky Balboa, which I've covered before on this podcast, for a while there was conversations about would there be a Rocky 7? I mean, Stallone was really having a purple patch that he'd revived Rambo and that had made money. He'd revived Rocky and that had got over the less successful 1990 film Rocky 5. And at this stage in his career as well, the writer, director, star had invented a brand new, hugely successful action franchise with The Expendables. First one of those had come out in 2010. Again, I've covered that one before. But still, there were constant rumours. Would he go back and play Rocky Balboa again? Would there be a Rocky 7? Would he go back to the film that basically started his career in the mid-1970s, that won the Best Picture Oscar and gave Sylvester Stallone to mass market cinema? Well, the answer to this was sort of that as much as there was conversations about a new Rocky film, the conversation that one was going ahead was, well, it came in July 2013. And this was an announcement that Michael B. Jordan was going to come in to play the character Adonis Creed, the son of Apollo Creed from the main run of Rocky movies, that Sylvester Stallone was going to come back and play Rocky Balboa. And this young upcoming director by the name of Ryan Coogler was given the job of steering the film off the back of a movie which he hadn't even made at the time he pitched this, called Fruitvale Station. Now, that was a film that thoroughly put him and Michael B. Jordan on the map, but still, in the summer of 2013, the idea of a Rocky spin-off movie, well, it wasn't really one that was getting an awful lot of positive attention. Yet the story of how the film actually came to be started with Coogler himself, that his dad was a huge Rocky fan, and he was a huge Rocky fan as well. And he was days away from starting filming on Fruitvale Station, which would be his feature directorial debut. He'd signed with agents at the William Morris Agency, and he told them, when they were asking what kind of things do you want to do, I'd really love to do a Rocky project. I'd really love to do Creed. I'd love to do this spin-off. Now, he already knew Michael B. Jordan off the back of Fruitvale Station. Of course, he cast him in that film, but he didn't know Sylvester Stallone. This was absolute pie-in-the-sky stuff at the point his career was at that stage. And so it was his agents who put him and Stallone together in the same room. Now, Stallone around this time was in the early stages of working on a Broadway musical of the first Rocky movie, and he was also, in and around Expendable sequels as well. But still, he agreed to take the meeting with Ryan Coogler, and days away from the start of filming on Fruitvale Station, Ryan Coogler left the set. On his way to his meeting from the set with Sylvester Stallone, he popped in at the DVD shop and got himself a copy of Rocky II on disc to take along, because Rocky II was his dad's favourite film of the franchise, and he figured the worst he's going to get out of this is an autographed copy of that that'd be able to give to his dad. And so Coogler would explain the next bit in an interview with Deadline that came up around the time of the film's release, and he explained how I'm in his office. He walked over and shook hands, and he said, I was expecting to be shaking hands with Rocky because that was the only way I'd seen him. And he said, I was so taken aback by how different his mannerisms were, how he talked, how he walked. And he said, I'm like, whoa, that was all a performance. And this dude's got to be a crazy good actor to be able to trick not only me, but the world into thinking that's who he is. And so the conversation got underway, and Coogler said he explained about his father, and Stallone was going, oh, okay. And in the interview, he said, I can't tell if he's into it or not. And he said, I kind of got the vibe that he wasn't, which I could understand. And so he said, I finally said, maybe we could take a picture for me and my dad. Stallone said, man, no problem. He says, I've still got the picture. And Stallone reached round and got a load of stuff off his shelf, T-shirts and signed bits and bobs, and signed them all for Coogler's dad. And Coogler said, I'm freaking out, going home with this stuff. So right there, it felt like a victory for me. Just the fact that I even told Sly the story that was based on me and my dad's relationship. Because that was the story that was going to be at the heart of the Creed movie that Ryan Coogler had pitched to Sylvester Stallone. And I do want to go spoiler light on it, but there was a whole spin-off about this up-and-coming boxer who'd overcome a difficult upbringing and found his way through boxing. And so Stallone went away and considered this, and the story that did the rounds at the time was that it was his wife, Jennifer, who was ultimately instrumental to convincing him to take the film on. But Stallone was impressed with Coogler, and Stallone, to be fair, does have a bit of a track record of taking chances on people. And so, as Coogler went off to do his film, Fruitvale Station, Stallone's agent then called in producer Irwin Winkler, who had, of course, produced all of the Rocky films to this stage. And in Winkler's memoir, he talks about this. He says Stallone's agent, Adam Bennett at William Morris, called me many times in 2013 trying to get me to hear a pitch for a new Rocky. And he said the pitch was from a USC film school graduate who lived in California. And he said, I told Bennett I really wasn't interested in hearing from another young filmmaker with an idea. He said, we get these pitch calls constantly, and sometimes a pitch is similar to an idea that we worked on, and then we get a lawsuit for using the idea. So Winkler had become a bit immune to this. He'd fought lawsuits on Rocky films before where people had, in his view, wrongly claimed that the material had been purloined, and he had no intention of putting himself in that position again. What changed, though, was Fruitvale Station was completed, and he took a look at it, and he saw the film, and he was hugely impressed, and he was like, oh, heck, there's something here. And so he got in touch with Ryan Coogler's agent at that stage and invited him for lunch, and Coogler's agent said they'd had the meeting with Stallone sometime before, that there was interest there. He just had to go and complete this film, which he'd done. And so now Irwin Winkler was on board, Sylvester Stallone was on board, Ryan Coogler was on board, and there was just the parent studio really that needed to be convinced, that being MGM. Never the most cash-rich of studios in the history of like the film stories that I've been telling on this podcast. But a meeting was soon arranged with the bosses of the studio, Gary Barber and John Glickman, And they nearly bit the pair's hand off, because here was one of the studio's most successful franchises and a way to do a new take on it, to take it off in a new direction. MGM was in. I mean, it's also worth noting that a film like Rocky Balboa hadn't cost an awful lot of money to make and had done particularly well at the box office. There are no massive special effects involved in a boxing movie. And the most something like Creed was going to cost was going to be, 35, I think it was 35 million in the end was the bill for the movie. And MGM was happy to fund that. And so Coogler went off and started writing the script at the beginning of August 2013. Now, Winkler talks about this in his book, which is called A Life in Movies, Stories from 50 Years in Hollywood. It's well worth a read. And he talks about how when Stallone goes off and writes a script, it generally takes him 7 to 8 weeks, and then they've got a draft. Coogler was taking a lot longer. He was a lot more deliberate in this part of the process. I'd suggest that's what made him so swift in the back end of the process. So he started writing that script in August 2013. The first outline really came in. I mean, it took him as much time to do an outline as it used to take Stallone to do the screenplay. That came in on October the 13th. Then it would be nearly a year until they got a draft that they were happy with. Drafts were going backwards and forwards and people were leaving notes, but it had taken 13 months from the start of Coogler writing for them to come up with a finished script. And Coogler wasn't making another film in the intervening period. He was writing and working on this one. The draft came in at 205 pages long, and the old adage is 1 page of script equals 1 minute of screen time. And with the best will in the world, Creed is no Batman. There's no way someone's going to sit through 3 hours of it. Well, I would. But still, it needed to come down. And there were also discussions about the fate of the Rocky Balboa character in the movie. Now, infamously, when Stallone came to do Rocky V, again, all the way back in 1990, there were prolonged conversations about would they kill Rocky off at the end of it. If you go back to the first Rambo movie, there was a conversation there. Would you kill Rambo off? Now, with Rocky V, they resisted that in the end, but the conversation came back up because Coogler wanted, in his original drafts of this, Rocky Balboa to die in the film, that he would be afflicted by something that would ultimately take his life. And Winkler and Stallone were resistant to that. They didn't want that to be the way that it went. They'd sort of been down that road before and pulled back. And eventually, between the three of them, they agreed a story direction, which is what happens in the film instead. Again, going particularly spoiler light on this one. But the rest of it, I mean, the green light was pretty much given at that point. The movie was going to press ahead. Warner Brothers was going to be involved through New Line Cinema with the producing of it as well and would distribute the film. And it was on November the 10th that news broke of real-life boxers Tony Bellew and Andre Ward joining the ensemble for this particular film. That had been, several months... I mean, if you remember, I started this particular one with the announcement that came through in July of 2013, and it had taken some time to get to this stage, but the casting was well underway at this point. Stallone was going to come in and play Rocky Balboa, of course, and right from the start, the idea was Michael B. Jordan would come in and play Adonis Creed in the movie. So at the point the real-life boxers were coming in, it was, the thinking there was, let's start shooting it in January 2015. And the last major piece of the casting jigsaw was completed when Tessa Thompson climbed aboard in December 2014. She'd broken through earlier that year for her performance in the film Dear White People and landed her role partly off the back of that. And Ryan Coogler's Dream Rocky project was ready to go. Filming was ready to begin at the start of 2015, and this had been a relatively smooth run to production. That production too would begin on time. I mean, going back to the Deadline interview that I mentioned just before, the outlet asked Ryan Coogler what was the best advice that Sylvester Stallone gave you before filming. And Coogler said there were so many things, but the first one was this idea of shooting the fight stuff at the beginning and completely separating it from the dramatic stuff. And he said it was an idea that I probably would have had to find out the hard way. And so the crowd filing into Goodison Park in Merseyside on the 19th of January 2015 thought they were going to watch a Premier League football match between Everton and West Bromwich Albion, which duly they did. Now, spoiler, the match ended in a 0-0 draw. Kevin Morales missed a penalty for Everton, and it was regarded as pretty much a dour football match. But that game became known for something else, because notwithstanding that missed penalty, the most memorable part of it was Sylvester Stallone was in town. And not just that, Sylvester Stallone was in town to film the first scene of Creed. Now, the plan was that they were going to use the crowd that had assembled in Goodison Park and shoot material at half-time, which gave them, a 10-minute window to get some footage in the can and to get some crowd sequences. And so Stallone was there. He appeared on the big screen and explained to the fans what was going to happen, that they were recording sequences for the new Rocky film. A note was put on the scoreboard at the match just before the halftime whistle that said filming for the new Rocky movies taking place at halftime to be included, please stay in your seats. And lots of people did, even if they didn't massively look hugely impressed by it. Now, the Everton link came through boxer Tony Bellew, who had this role in the film and a huge Everton fan. And Sylvester Stallone has since gone on to say he's a huge Everton fan as well. And the first sequences, the first footage was in the can for the movie. Now, the rest of the shoot would go out of the UK and would go back to the US. It would be in Rocky's spiritual home in Philadelphia, was where a good chunk of the film was shot, in the Pennsylvania area. Las Vegas was the backdrop for one or two bits as well. But even as filming was in its early stages, there was some degree of confidence here, because Warner Brothers announced the release date of November the 25th, 2015. It was going to come out that year in prime season at the US box office to capitalise on the 40th birthday of the original Rocky movie. Now, there was still umming and ahhing as production went on, even though it quickly became clear that Coogler was a very, very skilled director. What the major piece of umming and ahhing was over the ending of the movie. And this regularly comes up with Rocky films. Who's going to win the fight? Does the character of Adonis Creed win the ultimate fight at the end of the film? Well, I ain't telling you, but I will tell you that Ryan Coogler was persuaded in the end to shoot it both ways, and they would test that in post-production, which I'll come to shortly. Now, Coogler would shoot this movie to budget and on time as well. And Sylvester Stallone, once he'd committed to the film, he was utterly in the boat on it. He lost £20 to play the version of Rocky Balboa we see in the movie and was putting in a strong performance. That much was very, very, very clear. Now, to shoot the film, Coogler had a slightly offbeat choice, that he picked Maurice Alberti. Now, she wasn't an experienced cinematographer, certainly by the nature of big Hollywood productions. Her work had primarily been in independent stuff. She'd worked on, you go down her CV, she'd worked on things like Velvet Goldmine, with Happiness, Joe Gould's Secret. But the one that really brought her to Ryan Coogler's attention was The Wrestler, which had come out in 2008. And that was really the kind of look that Coogler was trying to capture with this. He wanted a bit more of a gritty, down-to-earth Rocky film, and Winkler admitted he was a little bit nervous at the choice at first, but quickly went along with it. Another thing that made Winkler nervous was this young, relatively inexperienced director had this plan for a really ambitious shot in the middle of a fight sequence, that he wanted to do a fight in one long Steadicam take, utterly uninterrupted. Now, the planning of this was quite intense, as you would imagine, and again, Winkler admits to being nervous with this one, but he was quite hands-off with the shooting of the film. He did step back and let Coogler make his movie, and the take that ended up in the can remains an absolute standout sequence in the movie, I think. Now, there was still a little bit of help that Coogler needed from Stallone in terms of what he was allowed to ask Michael B. Jordan to do. Because when they actually got to the boxing matches that they needed to film, well, Jordan needed to take a few punches. However, the law didn't actually allow didn't allow Ryan Coogler, as his director, to say, you need to get punched in the face. And so going back to that Deadline interview, Coogler explained this. He said, legally, I'm never in the position to say, hey, Mike, get punched in the face. I just can't. He's in there with dangerous dudes. And he said, we were taking a look at a high-speed shot we were doing, and it didn't look right. And so Coogler turned to Stallone and said, can you have a look at it and see what's wrong? And Stallone says, but once he'd looked at it and looked at it again, he turns and looks at me and smiles and says, Mike's got to take the punch. And I was just like, I can't tell him that. He says, no problem. And so Stallone went into the ring and told Michael B. Jordan, hey man, you can't be the punk who made a Rocky movie and didn't get hit in the face. And that was a conversation that could be had actor to actor, but not director to actor. And as a result of that conversation, Michael B. Jordan got punched in the face. Now, main photography wrapped up on this film on April the 3rd, 2015. It had been just shy of a 3-month shoot, and Coogler had 6 months really to get his film together and sort out a final cut that Warner Brothers and MGM could release, and he did not hang around. Now, this is where all the work he'd done early really paid off, because Coogler had spent so much time writing and getting this story right, and it was so from his heart and so from his upbringing that he knew the film that he wanted to make. And so directors are generally mandated, I think they get 10 weeks to deliver their first cut of a movie. They're allowed under Directors Guild of America rules to have the first cut and to present it. Well, Coogler had a first cut together in half of that time and presented it to Stallone and presented it to Winkler, and it was going down really rather well. Now, what happened at that stage was there were these two endings bolted to the end of the movie. And so they did the time-honoured Hollywood thing of they got test audiences together and they played the same film with demographically similar audiences side by side and compared how they came out. And it was a close run thing on this one. The scores did not give them a preference for one ending or the other. It was so marginal, the difference in those totals, that they had the freedom to pick. So this has happened before. If you go back to 1989's Turner and Hooch, the Tom Hanks and a dog film, that was one where they tested it and it came back roughly equal. And so the filmmakers were given the opportunity to choose which ending they went with. Now, in the case of Turner and Hooch, fiscally it was said that they made the wrong decision on that one, going particularly spoiler light. In the case of Creed, they had the scores in front of them, and again they could pick. And I'm not going to tell you which one they went for, but it was tested and tested to the point where it gave them the confidence to go with the one that was in their gut. Now, there was still some more material that was required, because when they had a look at Coogler's first cut, what they realised is they needed a bit more background material just to set up the character of Adonis Creed in the movie. And so 2 months after that principal photography had ended, in June 2015, they went back and just shot an extra sequence or two of a young Adonis Creed in juvenile detention earlier in the film. That's some of the stuff you see that front loads the film. And those were the last shots that were added into the midst of it. Meanwhile, there was still this online discourse, really, that they're making a Rocky spin-off movie. That's going to be nothing special, is it? It's just like they're flogging a dead horse. All the usual cliches were coming out. And then the trailer came out. Now, the trailer for this one came out in June 2015, just as they were shooting that extra material for the movie. And I think that's where the narrative surrounding Creed really dramatically turned, because the trailer, appreciating you can't judge films particularly by trailers, was really good. And the conversation around the film was really good as well. And all of a sudden, Creed became a film that was creeping onto more and more people's radar. There was the feeling that this movie might actually be really, 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 really strong. Of course, the ultimate test of that would be when it was put in front of an audience. And the press campaign started to ramp up in the autumn of 2015. They staged the first big press event for the film in Philadelphia, again, the spiritual home of the Rocky films. But the premiere for the movie went to Los Angeles on November the 20th, 2015. And, well, the critical response for the film was outstanding. Really outstanding, an absolute flat-out surprise. And I remember at the time, I was editing the website Den of Geek at the time, and my colleague Ryan Lambie went along to see the film, and he just reported back, it's incredible. It's really, I weren't expecting that. I mean, I would have been happy with Rocky 4 again, personally, which sort of we got next. But this was getting not just good reviews, this was getting rave reviews. And more than that, it went more than the nostalgia. It was Coogler's direction was coming in for praise. Michael B. Jordan's performance was coming in for praise. Tessa Thompson's great in it as well. She was getting praise. But there was talk that started to build up that, you know what, Sylvester Stallone might be back in the running for an Academy Award. That it's often forgotten that he got a Best Actor Oscar nomination for Rocky. And here he was reprising the role 4 decades later. And could he be the first actor to get a nomination for exactly the same role decades apart? And so, just as the film was launching towards cinemas, there was also an awards build-up that was coming as well. So the film launched into US cinemas properly on November the 25th, 2015. It had cost $40 million, and it was a hit. Its opening weekend was some $30 million over the Thanksgiving long holiday in the US. It opened alongside The Good Dinosaur from Pixar, which knocked it down into 3rd place. The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2 was on its 2nd week and had grossed $75 million. The Good Dinosaur was 55. And Creed over the 5-day Thanksgiving weekend got $42 million in the bank. The films that were also around at the time, I mean, Spectre was around, and that wasn't doing shabby business. The Peanuts movie, that had made a lot of money. That's one that's often overlooked, but that was doing really respectable money. The Night Before was around. Spotlight, that would go on to get Best Picture at the Oscars. Brooklyn, The Martian was still hanging around, and Fox had opened Victor Frankenstein that same weekend on a small number of screens. The word of mouth continued to be good for Creed, and it continued to stick around even in the subsequent weeks as films like Krampus and In the Heart of the Sea would come out against it. Then Star Wars, even as Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens came out, Creed was hanging on boldly there in 5th place, nearly a month after its original release. And by the time its US box office run was done, it had grossed $109 million in America, the most successful Rocky film in some time at that point. It added another $63 million overseas for a worldwide gross $173 million. Now that alone would have made everyone concerned really rather happy. And then the awards momentum continued to build. I mean, notably, it was the Golden Globes, as derided as they deservedly are now, that kind of turned the conversation, really, that Sylvester Stallone won Best Supporting Actor for his work in Creed at the Golden Globes that year. Sylvester Stallone would also get that Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and the feeling going into the ceremony was he was likely to win it as well. Now, the story didn't quite pan out that way, that Mark Rylance for Steven Spielberg's Bridge of Spies would win the gong that year, but this had been, there was no other way to describe it, an absolute triumph of a project. It even managed to paper over the fact that there was some furore over piracy of the movie when, because Warner Brothers was aggressively pushing the film for Oscar contention, it was sending out awards DVDs to members of the assorted voting academies, and one of those DVDs leaked online. Now, this was nothing new at the time because lots of films were leaking online. What was different and what turned this into a high-profile case was they managed to trace who they felt had leaked it. Now, this story is online, and I can't afford any lawyers, so I just say the person who they traced it back to was insistent that he'd never actually seen the disc and that someone had intercepted it some way. I've got no urge to step into that legal fight, but what's interesting is the film leaked and was widely being pirated at the point it was in cinemas, but was doing great guns in cinemas. Now, the knock-on from the success of that film was multiple, really. That by January 2016, there was already talk of a sequel coming. And in fact, it was confirmed at the start of 2016 that we were going to see a Creed 2. What was also quickly apparent was that Ryan Coogler would not be directing this one. I will come to Creed 2 in a future podcast, but It was Ryan Coogler who got the job of directing a Marvel movie by the name of Black Panther off the back of his Creed work, and Michael B. Jordan would go along with him for that movie as well. And at the point this podcast is being recorded, after the success of Creed 2, so where are we? March 2022 at the moment. Michael B. Jordan is now directing Creed 3, which is going to be out, 8-9 months away from when I'm talking now. Who knows? There might be a future podcast episode all about that. Which brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories. Thank you, as always, for listening. We're in the parish notices bit, so I'll crack through these as quick as I can. If you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, and perhaps even financially supporting it, if you head over to Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew, if you support me and the podcast there, then you tend to get the podcast early. You get bits of gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. I tend to break Film Stories news first there, and thank you to everyone who supports me there. The investment that you do allows me to pay more new writers to come through and give more opportunities to people, and it is hugely appreciated. Thank you too to everyone who's been subscribing to this podcast. Things like that really help independent podcasts like this one. If you can hit the subscribe button, and if you can ideally leave a hugely positive review as well, it is absolute gold dust to me. One more thing too, I'm in the midst of doing new issues of Film Stories and Film Stories Junior magazines that will be going up for pre-order shortly. You can find all of those at store.filmstories.co.uk. I'm sure I'll be annoying you about those in subsequent weeks as well. But for now, I'm moving to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. Now, this one is regarded as a notable box office flop. It's also a Kevin Costner project, and I'm rather fond of the work of Kevin Costner. So let's see how we get on with this one. I'm going to play you a clip, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
In the future, after the Great War, our civilization lies in ruin. Government does not exist. Technology has been erased. And everything man remembers is gone. Out of the chaos, a lawless army will arise to prey on the few survivors. But to a people who have lost their hope,
you are a dangerous man. I can see it in your eyes.
he will give them courage.
I have a feeling about you.
He will restore their memories of the past.
It's the individual that counts.
These people don't need dreams. They need help. Are you going to bring them that?
I want him bound. I want him dealt with.
He will unite them
You have a gift, Postman.
with a message of freedom.
I challenge the leadership of the Klan. You want a war? I'll give you a war!
Now that was a clip from the trailer from 1997's The Postman, directed by Kevin Costner, penned by Eric Roth and Brian Helgeland, based on David Brin's book, The Postman, and starring Costner in the lead role alongside Will Patton, Lorenz Tate, Olivia Williams, James Russo, and a cameo from Tom Petty. And so, let's go back to the novel, because The Postman was a novel that was originally released in 3 parts and finally brought together in 1 volume in 1985, written by David Brin, who maintains an active website that I've drawn on for parts of this story. And it told the story of a man who is named in the book, but not in the film, who in post-apocalyptic times claims to be a postman and then finds himself gradually emerging as a symbol of hope as he gradually eases his way into the role. Quite whether he leaves a card and claims he's left your parcel behind the bin, I can't actually claim. I've not fully read the book, but that kind of thing. And so the book's combined edition was enough to earn attention and awards, and soon also it got the attention of Hollywood that this was just the kind of sweeping story that there must be a film in there somewhere. And so Brin has written extensively about the journey to the screen of his story on his website, and he kicked off with a tale that his wife Cheryl turned to him during a screening of the 1989 movie Field of Dreams. I'm quite fond of that film. And at that point suggesting, wouldn't Kevin Costner be perfect for the lead role in a film of The Postman? However, Brin had actually sold the movie rights to the book within months of it coming out. He'd done a deal with, as he would admit, the first bidder who came along. Now, not a particularly shabby first bidder. Producers Steve Tisch and Wendy Feineman would go on to produce Forrest Gump and win an Oscar for that. And so Tisch would then, once he'd secured the rights, hire Eric Roth, who would also win an Oscar for Forrest Gump, to pen the screenplay for The Postman. But Brin was not happy with what Roth was coming up with at that stage. And so, as he penned on his site, Roth had acquired a reputation as a skilled adapter of already existing material. He said, alas, this time, without a strong director holding the reins, and there wasn't a director involved at this point, Ross decided to toss out every iota of the book and start from scratch with a story that was completely his own, incidentally going out of his way to reverse every moral point of The Postman. Now, Eric Roth completed his script and the project made its way out into Hollywood, and we were heading to the early 90s at this stage. But there was a disconnect that people weren't really biting. It was attracting big names. The book had certainly attracted big names as well. Director Ron Howard and star Tom Hanks were linked at one point. I mean, they've been working together on things like Apollo 13. But the script at this stage wasn't winning them over, and neither fully committed to it. Names such as Robin Williams and Michael Keaton, I've seen theirs in the mix pop up in stories around the film. Directors such as Barry Levinson, director of Rain Man, the late Richard Donner, they were said to be around. But also this was going to be Hanks's first film after he'd finished filming Forrest Gump at one stage. But when Hanks didn't commit, the whole thing went back into development hell. Now, that didn't stop others being interested in it and talking to David Brin about the movie. He talks on his website about how he took a call from Richard Dreyfuss, and Dreyfuss was happy to give him creative control over the script. But David Brin did not own the screen rights to the book. He couldn't do anything about it, whether Dreyfuss wanted him to or not. What turned the project, though, was Kevin Costner. That he'd not directed a film since 1990's Dances with Wolves, which was his directorial debut, which had just happened to win 7 Oscars, including a couple for Costner himself. Since then, he'd gone on to become one of the biggest movie stars in the world off the back of films like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves and The Bodyguard. But he'd also started to become a target for the Hollywood press. 1995's Waterworld, infamously, box office success, although you'd never guess it by the ink that's written about it, was, that had a target firmly painted on its back. I've covered that before. The charming and wonderful Tin Cup followed, but still there was a feeling that Costner was going to direct again. What would his second film as director be? And even if the box office returns of his movies was starting to dwindle, I mean, A Perfect World with Clint Eastwood hadn't done great guns at the box office. Well, I mean, studios were wanting to get involved. And Costner got interested in The Postman. And he decided, in 1996, it finally came together for it. He decided that's the one he's going to direct next. He'd wrapped up his work on Tin Cup at this stage, and Warner Brothers, who'd had a huge hits with Costner, with The Bodyguard, with Robin Hood, got involved too. That even though the box office wasn't quite what it used to be for his movies, the last time he directed, Dances with Wolves, had been made for not very much money, had made a lot of money, had won lots and lots and lots of Oscars. Costner, thus, when he came aboard the project, he took things back to basics, that he started again effectively on the script, and he was on board with David Brin on the things that had gone awry in the adaptation that Eric Roth had penned. Now, quickly, Wendy Feineman left the film, with Warner Brothers paying her off in exchange for taking no credit. Costner brought in Brian Helgeland, who was on the verge of winning an Oscar for LA Confidential, and they went back to the source novel. And as Brin explains, Costner and Helgeland picked the bits that they liked, added in more, and Brin was quite happy with what they were doing there. He felt they captured the heart of the main character, that the embellishments they'd done to the world seemed to work. He agreed with the dialing back of some of the heavy science fiction and CG elements of all of this. And this was going to be a very outdoor, epic sweep kind of film, and he was on board with that. as was Warner Brothers. And why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't it back the second film from such an acclaimed director? And it agreed to stump up $80 million to make the movie. And this wasn't $80 million where it would share the risk, as was becoming the trend in Hollywood at the time, with studios entering into co-productions left, right and centre. No, Warner Brothers were going to stump up the whole $80 million itself to fund this, and would sit back and count the profits from it. And so we got to the end of 1996. This was clearly happening. Costner had committed to make another film straight after. It wouldn't be the one he made after in the end, called For the Love of the Game, which would ultimately be directed by Sam Raimi, and lots of stories around that film as well. But he knew what he was going to do after The Postman, but still the year ahead of him was about bringing The Postman to the screen. Now, clearly he was going to take the lead role in the movie himself, but in terms of all the supporting parts, well, the female lead of the character of Abby, Costner poured through audition tapes left, right and centre to try and find her. And at this stage, British actor Olivia Williams, well, she was, depending which interview you read, she was in the middle of a law conversion course. She was taking on a supporting role in a television adaptation in the UK of Emma. She was doing auditions for all sorts of adverts, but she hadn't broken through. Now, Costner saw something in her audition tape and called her in for a meeting and would eventually cast her. And this would be a moment, it's worth noting, that would completely open her career up to films such as Rushmore with Wes Anderson, The Sixth Sense with M. Night Shyamalan. And as she told The Independent, with The Postman, I thought, this is beyond weird. It's inconceivable. I became an actress to do Shakespeare on stage, and I'm going to make a huge multi-million-dollar movie. I'm just going to do what I'm told and enjoy myself. She would ultimately land the role 2 weeks after she'd come in for that meeting and audition with Costner. And then in February 1997, when her casting was announced, Lorenz Tate was also brought in. I mean, he enjoyed success with Dead Presidents at this stage, and he scored a key role of Ford Lincoln Mercury in the movie, with Will Patton coming aboard as the villainous General Bethlehem. Full steam ahead then, and the start of production was earmarked for the 10th of March 1997, and Warner Brothers had its eye on releasing this as one of its big Christmas movies that year. Presumably did so as well, with one eye on a potential Oscar race as well. That notwithstanding, there it was, up and running, 10th of March, and this was a film that very early on would also take advantage of the burgeoning interest from this World Wide Web thing that had started to spring up, to the point where the making of the film was in part highlighted online whilst production was still ongoing. That the marketing boss at Warner Brothers at the time, a man called Chris Pooler, launched a campaign where a live netcast, as it was called at the time, how quaint at the time, of Costner directing a movie was screened across the internet, and naturally the server crashed as people tried to watch it, but nonetheless they got all the headlines they needed from it, and there was an awareness that this film was happening and that Costner was directing again. Now, he wanted to do this, perhaps unsurprisingly, with an epic sweep. He wanted things to be done in camera for real. He didn't want to be finding his movie in edit suites. He didn't want to be relying on complicated special effects to come in. And in fact, the effects work that was used in the film was primarily done in camera that would cause some, let's just say some conversations behind the scenes. The film was shot well away from Hollywood, as all of his directorial efforts have been, with locations taken in Washington State, Arizona and Oregon. And it was pumping money into small communities as well. I mean, I found a thing in the Los Angeles Times about, after kicking off production in Tucson, Arizona in early March, the Kevin Costner pick pump-primed businesses in Oregon to the tune of $6 million in April and May. And Warner Brothers was keen to play up the fact that this was going round small communities and investing in those areas. The Mountain School in a town called Bend in Oregon, Mountain View High School, got a boost last month, it reported, when a wave of crew members looking for a little entertainment on a Saturday night helped to sell out a Mountain View High Theatre version of Grease. So Tom Petty, I mentioned him briefly, he came in for a cameo at one stage. This was not a surprise. It was revealed by Variety in July 1997 as filming continued. It would turn out to be a contentious cameo, although, again, author David Brin was one of those who defended it. Now, to get the look of the film, considering they weren't going to use post-production CG as they probably do now to achieve this, what they did is they took a lot of existing real buildings and had to make them look old and post-apocalyptic, and they were importing huge amounts of dirt in order to do so. A gigantic pit at one stage was used for a prison sequence early in the movie, which is the moment in the film, if you've not had the pleasure, where people protest about watching the film Universal Soldier because instead they want to watch The Sound of Music. That's a particular highlight bit for me of the movie. But there was tittle-tattle coming out, and I think part of this is there was a target on his back at this stage in the tabloids about Costner not being the easiest person to work with while he was making The Postman. And in fact, David Brin would post a blog 20 years after the film came out where he kind of doubled down on this a little bit. He didn't say anything at the time, but he said, alas, Costner's behaviour towards the original author was inexplicably unnecessarily brusque and ultimately self-destructive, he argued. He said, I never publicly complained, and in fact, Kevin Costner admitted later that I was a team player trying hard to help promote the film, but he said, I've since learned that people noticed. He said it didn't help, and he said a side gripe. When I visited the set in Arizona, getting 18 whole words with him, he couldn't have told an underling to throw a uniform on this bozo and give him a cameo, put him in formation with the others in our next scene and tell him to stay quiet. And Brin did not get his cameo in the film. Now, Costner was in the midst of carrying an $80 million production on his shoulders. He was a target for the press, left, right and centre, as he had been throughout the making of Dances with Wolves as well. But he was out in the open shooting his movie, whether he was easy to work with or not, and production wrapped up on the 22nd of July 1997. And finally, after a journey that had gone on for over a decade, the movie of The Postman was in the can. Now, there wasn't an awful lot of time in post-production to shape the final cut of such a long film here, and it was clear that Costner was going to deliver a long film. But also, this was a film done, again, in camera that didn't require an awful lot of post-production refining. And Costner was defensive in some interviews and the build-up to the film's release when it became clear just how long the film was going to be. He said, what can I say? He told the Los Angeles Times. I guess I've always marched the beat of my own drummer and tried to make decisions to please myself, not just to pander to the critics. And he would describe himself as an unconventional filmmaker. But when Warner Brothers started testing the film, well, it realised it might have a bit of a problem here because the test audiences and the test screenings for The Postman were described as, quote, disastrous, to the point where the studio went to Costner and asked him to cut the 3-hour movie down. Now, Costner had final cut on this. He had creative freedom on the movie, and he refused to do so. As would be reported in the LA Times again, he said, to me, the length is just perfect. Frankly, I don't know of any way how I could have made it shorter. And he explained, I guess you could cut out all the little sidebars, those scenes that give the characters some of their motivations. What would that accomplish, though? My movie might be too long to fit into your dinner plans, but when it's a really good movie, you don't care. You don't want it to ever end. And so Warner Brothers it had this film on its hands that it knew it was going to have a problem with. That it started the promotion of the film, understanding that the test screenings had not gone well. And this was an era as well where reports of test screenings were starting to leak out onto that awful World Wide Web thing that I just mentioned before. And the buzz around the film, as it was coming towards its release on Christmas Day, 1997 in the US, was not strong. And in fact, it would come up against some pretty momentous competition as well. First of all, it had to go in front of the critics, and the critics duly gave it an absolute kicking. The reviews for The Postman were, on the whole, absolutely hostile. That they were accusing Costner of making an egotistical movie, of basically the film not working, going on too long, that even though its heart might have been in the right place, that the film just was a failure in many people's eyes. Now, I've always been a little fonder of The Postman than most, but even I, as an avid Costner defender, would suggest this one probably goes on a little bit too long. And it's quite interesting. I don't think it's his best film. Costner was defensive of it at the time, but when it went, and he has been since, I'll come to that shortly, but when it went in front of cinema audiences, well, not a chance. It was released Christmas 1997, and this $80 million movie opened in 9th place with, $5.2 million on its opening weekend. And this was a case of very, very bad scheduling and very, very bad luck, because it had been opened against a film that a lot of people had written off. Costner was reportedly one of them. James Cameron's Titanic which had opened the week before. And Titanic is an absolute anomaly in box office reporting, in that the general thinking is when your film is released and gets its wide audience, then it's gradual decline week after week after week after week while other films came in. Titanic grew for week after week after week after week, and it absolutely dominated the box office for 2-3 months, knocking out films left, right and centre that were up against it. The Bond movie Tomorrow Never Dies opened the same weekend, and that did good money. But it was clear Titanic had even robbed some of James Bond's cash. If you look at the other films that opened against The Postman, I mean, Mr. Magoo was in 10th place. Flubber was still around. American Werewolf in Paris, the belated sequel, that had opened in 7th. Tarantino's Jackie Brown opened in 5th. As Good as It Gets opened in 3rd place. There were limited releases for Martin Scorsese's Kundun, for Barry Levinson's Wag the Dog as well. There was a lot of competition around, and the Oscar films were swilling around as well. And The Postman, I mean, bluntly, it just dropped like a stone. It was out of the top 10 inside 1 week, and by the time we go to its 3rd week on release, there it was, sat in 18th place, struggling to interest anyone, but really. It would gross in the end in the US, I think $17 million, a pretty disastrous total given the amount it had cost. Its box office total worldwide, overseas it only had a couple of $1 million. When it was all tallied up, $20.8 million were the box office returns for this. And it was also clear that fairly quickly, this wasn't a film that was going to get a quick redemption on DVD or VHS either. It was released on the formats in June of 1998, but it had just fizzled out of the conversation at that stage. It had picked up awards from the horrible Golden Raspberries. It had just become a punch bag, really, and Costner was left just taking the brunt of it, having, for better or worse, sunk his heart and soul into a film that, by most people's estimation, just hadn't worked. Now, in more recent times, certainly in the last year or two, as this has been recorded, actually, there's been a little bit of a resurgence for The Postman, a little bit more admiration for it, not least when the former president of the United States went for, let's just say, had some things to say about the United States Postal Service, and there were threats to it, and Costner came out and vocally made some points around that. Off the back of The Postman, he would actually he wouldn't do For Love of the Game straight afterwards, he'd do the film Message in a Bottle, and in fact he would have a full slate for the next couple of years, but he would be, his box office powers had taken a hit off the back of this, and in fact he'd never really have a gigantic hit off the back of his own name again, although he wouldn't actively chase one. And in the case of The Postman, it didn't put him off directing, and in 2003 he would direct the film Open Range, which I would suggest is absolutely terrific movie and one well worth seeking out. I think it's as a directorial effort, I'd place it above Dances with Wolves as well. I really like Dances with Wolves. And at the point this podcast is being recorded too, Costner is months away from starting filming his 4th directorial effort, another outdoors sweeping movie by the looks of it, by the name of Horizon. But for the purposes of The Postman story, I'm going to give him the last word on it. An interview that he gave to the Daily Beast in 2020. So this is 23 years after the movie was released. He said, listen, a movie is what it is when it comes out, and it has a chance to be revisited. I was always kind of proud of it. I thought I probably made a mistake not starting the movie off saying Once Upon a Time, because it's kind of like a fairy tale. Once upon a time, when things got really rotten, the only thing that could stand the test of time was the post office, the only thing that people could count on. And he said, I didn't say that, and I probably should have, because it's like a fairy tale you'd read to your children at night. That's how I did the movie, and that's how you can find the movie out there at the moment. He's never gone back and re-edited it, but a slightly clearer idea of what he was looking for. It will always, in truth, be one of Hollywood's most infamous flops of the last 20 or 30 years. Like a lot of infamous flops, though, there are a few interesting things under the bonnet. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories, and thank you as always for listening. If I've not bored you completely, you can get more of my waffle on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. You can find our website filmstories.co.uk, which is updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, mayhem, terrible jokes, all there. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can find our collection of magazines and our Blu-ray of the film Sneakers as well, is available to order there. Or at Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, youtube.com/filmstories. And if you want to see me live, I am live in Birmingham, just about a week or two away from the release of this podcast, on the 30th of March 2022, telling film stories in person at the Midlands Arts Centre. You can find more details and ticket information at filmstories.co.uk. For now, though, the most important thing, as always, is that you all stay safe and well and you look after yourselves. I thank you, as always, for listening. I thank you for your time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Bye-bye.
You're a godsend. A savior.
No, I'm just the postman.